What if the one weapon Iran has held over the world for 50 years just stopped working and nobody in Tehran wants to say it out loud? For half a century, one narrow strip of water gave Iran the power to shake the entire global economy with a single threat. That power is now cracking in real time, and the world is watching it happen. Before we go further, hit like on this video right now, not because I asked nicely, but because this algorithm only shows hard truth to people who prove they want it, so prove it, then subscribe. And send this to one person who still thinks Iran controls the oil map, because they don't, not anymore. Here's the water we're talking about, the Strait of Hormuz, just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, a thin gap between Iran on one side and Oman on the other. For 50 years, roughly a fifth of all the oil the entire planet burns has passed through that gap. Every tanker headed to Rotterdam, Tokyo, Los Angeles, Mumbai, it all had to squeeze through those 21 miles, right past Iranian shores, right within. Range of Iranian missiles, radar, and speedboats. That single fact turned Iran into something bigger than its economy or its army ever justified. A country with a GDP smaller than the state of Ohio could still make oil traders in New York sweat with one press release, threaten to mine the strait, and prices jumped, send fast boats near a tanker, and insurance companies raised their rates. Iran never needed a real war to win. It just needed the world to believe it could close that door whenever it wanted. Think about how strange that is when you really break it down. Iran did not need a large navy to matter on the world stage. It did not need advanced fighter jets or a nuclear arsenal to force presidents and prime ministers to take its calls seriously. It needed geography, and it needed the world's addiction to oil moving through one narrow channel. That combination did more for Iranian foreign policy than almost anything else the regime ever built. Every American president since the late 1970s has had to factor Hormuz into decisions about Iran, because closing that strait, even for a few days, could mean gas lines, inflation, and political fallout back home. That kind of quiet structural power is rare, and once a country has it, giving it up is almost unthinkable, which is exactly why Iran never stopped investing in the ability to threaten it. For decades, that investment paid off. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps built an entire naval doctrine around asymmetric warfare in those 21 miles of water, small fast boats swarming larger vessels, naval mines that could be laid quietly at night, coastal missile batteries hidden in mountains along the shoreline. None of it needed to defeat the United States Navy in open combat. It only needed to make the cost of keeping Hormuz open high enough that adversaries thought twice before pushing Iran too far. That was the entire strategy. Deterrence through the threat of chaos. And for a very long time, it worked exactly as designed. That belief is now being tested in the most direct way possible. Because since February of this year, the world has not been dealing in threats anymore. The United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran, and Iran responded the way it always promised it would. It moved to shut Hormuz down. Tankers stopped moving through it. Insurers pulled back. And for the first time in modern history, the choke point Iran spent decades building leverage around actually choked. But here is the part that is genuinely stunning, and the part most coverage of this story is getting badly wrong. Iran did not win that moment. It exposed itself. Because the second Hormuz effectively closed, two pipelines that most people had never heard of suddenly became the most important infrastructure on the planet. The first is Saudi Arabia's East-West Pipeline, sometimes called Petroline. It is not new. It was built back in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War, when Saudi Arabia first realized it could not afford to have its entire economy hostage to a strip of water it did not control. The pipeline runs about 750 miles, carrying crude from the oil fields near the Gulf Coast all the way across the desert to the port of Yanbu Amhwang, the Red Sea. From there, tankers load up and sail out through waters Iran cannot touch. For decades, that pipeline sat there as a backup plan, running at a fraction of its potential. Then the war started, and Saudi Arabia pushed it to its absolute limit. By late March, it was confirmed to be pumping at full capacity, 7 million barrels of oil every single day, all of it completely bypassing Hormuz. Tanker after tanker began redirecting to Yanbu, forming what some reports described as a lifeline keeping Saudi exports alive while its main route sat paralyzed. The second piece is the UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, often called ADCOP. It is smaller, built to move oil from onshore fields directly to the port of Fujairah, on the Gulf of Oman, on the other side of Hormuz from the danger zone. It normally carries somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million barrels a day. Not massive on its own, but combined with the Saudi line, these two pipelines together can move somewhere between 3.5 and 7 million barrels daily, all without a single tanker entering Iranian missile range. Now stop and really sit with that number for a second, because this is where the story gets uncomfortable for Iran. On a normal day, before any of this started, close to 20 million barrels of oil moved through the Strait of Hormuz. 20 million. The two bypass pipelines, even running flat out, cover somewhere around a quarter to a third of that. That is not nothing. That is a genuine lifeline, but it is nowhere near a full replacement, and understanding that gap is the key to understanding everything that is happening right now. Iran knows this gap exists, and that is exactly why, in April, Iranian forces struck the Saudi East-West Pipeline directly, cutting its throughput by roughly 700,000 barrels a day. Around the same time, Iranian drones hit the port of Fujairah, disrupting loading operations at the very terminal the UAE was counting on. This was not random. This was Iran looking at the one weakness in its enemy's plan and hitting it as hard as it could, because Iranian military planners understand something too. If those pipelines ever reach full, permanent, unstoppable capacity, the leverage that built the entire Islamic Republic's regional strategy disappears for good. It is worth pausing here to appreciate what the Saudis actually pulled off with that pipeline, because 7 million barrels a day is not a small technical achievement. Petroline runs across some of the harshest terrain on Earth: open desert, extreme heat, long stretches with almost no infrastructure nearby. Keeping that line, pumping at maximum output for months during an active war, means constant maintenance, constant security, and constant coordination between engineers and the military, all while the country's main export route sits under direct threat. Every barrel that reaches Yanbu safely is the result of thousands of people making sure a 50-year-old piece of infrastructure does not fail at the exact moment the entire country needs it most. There is also a quieter number worth knowing. Running parallel to the main crude line is a smaller pipeline carrying natural gas liquids from the same eastern fields to the same western coast, moving around 300,000 barrels a day of its own. It is already running completely full, with no spare room left to squeeze out more, which tells you something important. Saudi Arabia is not sitting on hidden extra capacity waiting to be unlocked. Every part of this backup system is already being pushed to its physical limit, which is exactly why the new expansion plans matter so much for what comes next. So here is where we are right now, in plain terms. The bypass is real. It is working. It is moving millions of barrels a day that would otherwise be stuck in a war zone. But it is not yet the knockout blow. It is a wounded giant's crutch, not a replacement leg. And both sides know it. Which brings us to the part of this story that should genuinely worry Tehran more than any single missile strike. Because while the war rages and headlines focus on burning tankers and closed straits, something quieter and far more permanent is happening in the background. The United Arab Emirates just announced it is fast-tracking a brand new pipeline, one that will double its Fujairah export capacity from 1.8 million barrels a day to 3.6 million. The country's crown prince personally directed the national oil company to accelerate construction, calling it necessary to meet global demand. That is not wartime panic talk. That is a long-term strategic decision being made in real time, with a target completion window sometime around 2027. Saudi Arabia is doing the same thing, quietly evaluating how to expand and debottleneck the East-West Pipeline even further, pushing beyond its current 7 million barrel ceiling. Energy analysts tracking the region describe this as a genuine race. Gulf states scrambling to build permanent alternatives so that the next time a crisis hits Hormuz, and there will be a next time, they are not caught depending on a single vulnerable waterway ever again. Even Iraq is exploring options now, looking at potential corridors running north through Turkey and toward the Mediterranean, though those plans remain years away. The pattern across the entire region is the same. Every Gulf producer that spent decades quietly accepting Hormuz as an unavoidable risk is now actively building its way out of that dependency. And they are doing it because this war proved the risk was never theoretical. What makes this moment different from every previous scare in the region's history is the money behind it. In the past, whenever tensions with Iran flared up, there would be talk of alternative routes, feasibility studies, cautious statements from energy ministers about long-term planning. Then tensions would cool, oil would keep flowing through Hormuz, and the urgency would quietly fade until the next crisis. That cycle repeated for decades. This time feels different because the money is already moving, construction crews are already on site, and government leaders are attaching their own names and reputations to these projects instead of leaving them buried in ministry reports. When a crown prince personally directs a national oil company to fast-track a pipeline, that is not a hedge anymore. That is a bet the country is willing to defend publicly, which makes walking it back politically expensive, even if the war ends tomorrow. There is also a quieter signal worth noticing. The kind of signal that rarely makes headlines but tells you everything about where confidence actually lies. Insurance markets, shipping companies, and long-term crude buyers are the most risk-averse people in the entire global economy. They do not move billions of dollars based on speeches or promises. They move based on what they believe will actually be true 2, 3, 5 years from now. The fact that so much capital and construction effort is flowing into Yanbu and Fujairah right now, in the middle of an active war, tells you that the people whose entire job is calculating risk have already concluded that Hormuz dependency is a problem worth paying to solve permanently, regardless of how this specific conflict ends. If you are still with me, that tells me you actually care about understanding this properly instead of just watching for the explosions. So do me a favor and drop a comment with one word, either Iran or Gulf, telling me who you think comes out ahead in the next 2 years. Because I want to see what this audience actually believes before I tell you what the data says. Let's talk about why this matters so much more than a normal infrastructure story, because pipelines get built all the time and nobody makes a video about it. This one is different because of what it does to the psychology of the oil market. For 50 years, the mere possibility that Iran could threaten Hormuz was priced into global oil, every time tensions rose. In the Middle East, traders did not wait to see if Iran would actually act. They assumed the worst and bought accordingly, driving prices up on fear alone. That fear premium was arguably worth more to Iran than any weapon in its arsenal, because it meant the entire world economy flinched every time Tehran raised its voice. That premium is now being tested against something it has never faced before: actual alternate supply that keeps moving even during an actual war, when oil prices spiked after Iran declared the strait. Closed, the spike did not hold. Within days, prices pulled back toward pre-crisis levels because traders watched tankers keep loading at Yanbu and Fujairah and slowly started to internalize a new reality: that a Hormuz closure no longer automatically means a global supply shock. It means a partial, painful, survivable disruption instead of a catastrophic one. That shift in psychology is worth more to the Gulf states than the barrels themselves, because once markets stop panicking every time Iran makes a threat, Iran's single most powerful diplomatic tool starts losing its edge. You can still light a fuse, but if everyone in the room has learned the room does not actually explode anymore, lighting it stops being frightening. Think about what that does to every future negotiation involving Iran. Sanctions relief talks, nuclear discussions, regional security arrangements, all of them have historically happened in the shadow of Hormuz, with Western negotiators quietly aware that pushing too hard could trigger a response that spikes oil prices and hurts their own economies back home. That shadow gave Iranian negotiators a kind of implicit power at the table, even when their actual bargaining position looked weak on paper. If that shadow keeps shrinking, if traders and governments alike start treating a Hormuz threat as an inconvenience instead of a catastrophe, then Iran walks into future negotiations with one less card than it has carried into every single one since the 1980s. That is not just an economic shift, it is a diplomatic one, and it will outlast this war by years. Now, let's be honest about the limits of this story too, because a truthful video is more powerful than an exaggerated one, and there are real limits here that matter. The Red Sea route through Yanbu is not risk-free. Houthi forces in Yemen have already shown they can strike commercial shipping and energy infrastructure in that exact corridor, which means Saudi Arabia has not eliminated risk, it has swapped one danger for a different one. Routing oil away from Iranian missiles does not mean routing it away from every threat in the region. The map of danger has shifted, not disappeared. And the numbers still matter enormously, even in the best-case scenario. With every planned expansion completed on schedule by 2027, the combined bypass capacity across Saudi Arabia and the UAE would still fall well short of what Hormuz alone used to carry on an average day. This is not a full replacement. It may never be a full replacement. What it is enough of a replacement to change the calculation, enough to mean that Iran can no longer assume a closed strait equals a paralyzed world. That distinction is everything. Iran spent 5 decades building coastal missile batteries, fast attack boats, naval mines, and radar networks, specifically designed to make one threat credible: the total shutdown of Hormuz and everything that depends on it. That threat only works if the world has no other way to move oil. The moment credible alternatives exist, even partial ones, the entire strategic architecture built around that threat starts to lose its foundation. Not instantly, not completely, but permanently, in the sense that the clock now runs one direction. Every barrel that moves safely through Yanbu or Fujairah during this war is proof that Iran's monopoly on Gulf oil transit was never actually total, and proof, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered. This is why the desperation in Iran's recent actions makes so much more sense once you understand the pipeline story underneath it. The attacks on the East-West Pipeline in April were not random escalation. They were a direct response to watching an alternative route succeed. The drone strikes on Fujairah were not just about damaging a port. They were about trying to kill the one thing that threatens Iran's entire strategic identity: the idea that the world has options. But here's the problem for Tehran, and it is a problem with no clean solution. Pipelines are far easier to defend than moving ships. They can be buried, monitored constantly, and repaired after damage instead of lost forever like a sunk tanker. Every strike Iran lands on this infrastructure causes real, painful disruption. But it does not undo the strategic shift underway. It slows it down. It does not reverse it. And every dollar Saudi Arabia and the UAE spend rebuilding and expanding these routes is a dollar spent, making the next Iranian threat weaker than the last one. Think about what that means for the regime's long-term position. Iran cannot easily extend its missile range to threaten Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. The geography simply does not allow it from Iranian territory. It could lean harder on Houthi allies in Yemen to threaten that corridor instead, and there is real evidence it has tried exactly that. But that puts Iran's strategy in the hands of a different armed group, on a different coastline, facing a different set of defenders, which is a far less reliable form of leverage than controlling the choke point directly from its own shores ever was. That is the quiet tragedy of Iran's position right now, if you can call a regional power's strategic decline a tragedy at all. Everything it built for 50 years was engineered for one specific battlefield. 21 miles of water it knew better than anyone else on Earth. Now the fight is partly moving somewhere else, to a coastline hundreds of miles away, defended by different navies, patrolled by different air forces, and Iran has no equivalent home field advantage there. It is being forced to fight on ground it never trained for, using allies it does not fully control, against infrastructure that gets rebuilt faster than it can be destroyed. That is not a winning position, no matter how loudly state media describes it. So where does that leave us? Not with Iran suddenly powerless, and not with Hormuz suddenly irrelevant, because neither of those things is true today. And what we are actually watching is something slower and, in some ways, more significant, the early stage of a permanent structural shift in how the world thinks about Gulf oil security. A shift Iran cannot bomb its way out of, because you cannot destroy an idea once the world has already seen the proof. If this kind of grounded, no-hype breakdown is what you actually came here for, subscribe now, not for me, but so you stop missing the videos that explain what is actually happening instead of just reacting to headlines. Because the next phase of this story is going to move fast, and I want you here when it does. Let's zoom out and think about what this really represents. Because underneath the pipelines and the barrel counts is a much bigger story about how power actually works in this region. For decades, the entire security architecture of the Gulf assumed Hormuz was unavoidable. American aircraft carriers patrolled it. Gulf monarchies built their foreign policy around not provoking Iran too far, precisely because nobody wanted to test what happened if the strait actually closed. That assumption shaped billions of dollars in military spending, decades of diplomatic caution, and an entire generation of energy. Policy built on the idea that this one waterway could never be worked around at scale. The war did what years of careful planning documents and academic papers never could. It forced a live, real-world test of that assumption, under maximum pressure, with real consequences if the theory failed. And the theory did not hold up perfectly for either side. Iran learned that closing Hormuz does not paralyze the world the way it once believed. The Gulf states learned that their backup plans, while real and functioning, are still not big enough to fully replace what they are protecting against. Both sides are walking away from this war with a more accurate, more humbling picture of their own leverage than they had before it started. That is usually how the biggest shifts in history actually happen. Not with a single dramatic announcement, but with a slow, forced correction of assumptions everyone believed for too long. Iran believed geography was destiny, that as long as it sat next to that narrow strip of water, the world would always need its cooperation. That belief held for 50 years because nobody ever had a strong enough reason to fully test it. Now it has been tested, and the answer that came back was more complicated and less favorable to Iran than 5 decades of unchallenged assumption suggested. History is full of powers that mistook a temporary advantage for a permanent one. Empires that controlled a trade route assumed that control would last forever, right up until a new route, a new technology, or a new alliance quietly made the old route optional instead of essential. The moment something becomes optional, even partially, its owner stops being able to name the price for using it. That is precisely the position Iran now finds itself edging toward. Not powerless, not defeated, but no longer able to assume the world has no other choice. And once a regime that built its entire regional strategy on being unavoidable discovers it has become merely inconvenient to work around, the psychological blow to its own leadership can matter just as much as anything happening on the battlefield. None. This means Iran's leverage disappears overnight, and anyone telling you it already has is selling you a fantasy instead of the facts. Hormuz still carries the overwhelming majority of Gulf oil exports even now. Iran can still strike shipping, still lay mines, still force insurance premiums higher with a single provocative move. The bypass pipelines are a genuine lifeline, not yet a full escape hatch. But lifelines have a way of growing. 7 million barrels a day was not always 7 million. It grew because the pressure to grow, it became undeniable. 3.6 million for the UAE by 2027 was not the plan 5 years ago. It became the plan because this war made the old plan too dangerous to keep relying on. That is the part that should actually worry Tehran the most, more than any single strike or any single spike in oil prices. It is not this year's numbers, it is the direction those numbers are moving in, and the fact that every side of this conflict, allies and rivals alike, now understands exactly why they need to keep moving in that direction long after any ceasefire is signed. Wars end. Infrastructure does not get torn down just because the shooting stops. Once these pipelines exist at higher capacity, once new lines are finished in 2027, once the world has proven to itself it can survive a Hormuz shutdown without total collapse, that knowledge does not unhappen. Iran can rebuild whatever gets damaged. It cannot rebuild the illusion that it holds the only key to the door. So when you hear people say the Strait of Hormuz just became irrelevant forever, understand what is actually true and what is exaggeration built for clicks. What is true is this: Iran's oldest, most reliable form of leverage is cracking in real time under conditions Iran itself created, and every barrel moving through Yanbu and Fujairah today is a small piece of proof that the crack is not closing back up. What is exaggeration is pretending the job is already finished, that the choke point is already fully bypassed, that the threat is already dead. It is not dead. It is wounded. And wounded things can still be dangerous, sometimes more dangerous than they were before, because a cornered power with fewer options left does not simply give up quietly. That is the real story here. And it is more interesting than the exaggerated version, because it comes with actual tension instead of a fake ending. This is not a finished chapter where the good guys already won and Iran already lost. This is the middle of a fight, a genuine race between a regime trying to prove its old leverage still matters, and a coalition of rivals trying to prove it never really needed to matter in the first place. Nobody knows for certain how that race ends. What we do know is that for the first time in 50 years, Iran is not the only one holding a card at this table, and every pipeline that reaches full capacity is one more card sliding out of its hands and onto the other side of the board. Iran built its entire regional identity around controlling a door nobody else could open. The world just started building windows. They're smaller, they're not finished, but they work, and once people learn a window exists, they stop being afraid of a door that only opens one way. That is not the end of Iran's leverage. It is the beginning of its end, and beginnings, once they start, are almost impossible to fully reverse. Somewhere in Tehran right now, planners who spent their entire careers mastering the geography of one narrow strait are looking at maps of pipelines they cannot reach and ports they cannot threaten, and having to explain to their own leadership why the plan that worked for 50 years suddenly needs a new one. That conversation, quiet, uncomfortable, and happening away from any camera, may end up mattering more than any single missile fired in this entire war, because wars end when the fighting stops. Strategic advantages end when the other side finally builds their way around you and stop pretending they ever needed your permission in the first place. If you made it this far, you now understand this story better than most of the channels covering it. So subscribe, share this with someone who is still getting the exaggerated version, and stay close, because the next milestone in this pipeline race, whichever side reaches it first, is going to tell us exactly how this ends.